Dream Team, it's your boy Neal back with another reaction video, guys. Here we are with 7 myths British people believe about America, part 1. Wait, what do y'all believe about us over here? Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel, ring notification bell, get a video a thumbs up so I get suggested. Social media, Patreon, all up top. You subscribe to any of it, put all the links in the description. All you gotta do is hit the link, follow me, talk to me, human, I talk back. You guys got a favorite video suggestion, you can subscribe to Patreon or drop it in the comment section. What we got?
Hello, this video is sponsored by BritBox, the premier streaming service for Britain's most beloved TV shows. I'm Lawrence Brown and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to myths. Specifically, myths that British people, including myself at one point, believed about the United States of America. But it is amazing what 14 years of living in the United States will do to your understanding and your perceptions about this very country. For instance, I learned early on that they don't have Cornish pasties, and I learned slightly less earlier on, so later, that Michigan has them. But I don't live in Michigan, so one way or another...
They said Cornish pasties? I don't even know what that is.
So later, that Michigan has them. But I don't live in Michigan, so one way or another, I still have to have them imported. A quick reminder that if you're not subscribed to this channel, you can change that fact about your life right now.
Change it.
But these myths go way beyond the absence of quintessentially British food. And so now that I've lived here for about a 1/7 of a century, it's time to outline some of the myths that us British believe about America and Americans. This is a funny one because I think television gives us this notion that Americans...
Nah. Most of us definitely cannot afford a regular size house, much less a giant house. Oh, that would be a dream. That would be a dream.
This is a funny one because I think television gives us this notion that Americans do all live in giant houses like the McAllisters do in Home Alone, but it's not entirely the case. Sure, I mean, statistically, American houses are on average larger than their UK counterparts. There are a number of reasons for this, which I outlined in this video. But to say that all Americans live in really large houses is a complete fabrication of anything resembling the truth. And I was a good example of this before I became a YouTube sensation. Because when I first moved to Chicago, we had to do things on a budget. Between me and my wife, we weren't making a great income, and this is a major city, so we had to sort of settle for an apartment whose dimensions were 300 square feet. And for those of you who don't know, that's about the size of a shoebox, roughly. You know, we had to leave our shoes outside the door. That's how small it was. And it is worth reiterating, I think, that the cost of living in the United States does fluctuate massively across the country. When I lived in Indiana, just one state over, we were paying about $530 a month. That's basically unheard of in Chicago. And it's certainly unheard of in New York City, which of course was the city in which the show Friends is set. And I think it's shows like that that gave us this impression that Americans were all living in big apartments.
Yeah, like he said, there's huge fluctuation across the country. And I'm sure that's with any country, fluctuation in prices. Because, I mean, the better parts of the country, or what's deemed as the better parts of the country, are going to have the more expensive pricing just because more people want to live there. So that does make sense. But $530 a month, Indiana. I might need to pay y'all a visit. I might need to pay y'all a visit, Indiana. That's almost half of what I pay here. But all right, but this is more than 300 square feet. But it's not huge. It's not huge. Talk to me.
That gave us this impression that Americans were all living in big apartments.
Each street
and speaking of houses, I was alerted to a tweet recently from a British person who couldn't believe that American addresses go way up into the thousands, and their belief on this was that every street in the United States has thousands of houses on it. And this was a belief that I used to have, because the country is absolutely massive, so you almost expect it to have to house that many people. But the thing is, there are way fewer people in this country per square mile than there are in Britain, so it doesn't add up. And that's when I got...
I did not know that. Wow. That's a new fact
in this
for
country
me.
per square mile than there are in Britain, so it doesn't add up.
Wow.
And that's when I got looking into it, and in a previous video I outlined it doesn't really work like that. On any given street, they don't start at the number 1 and then end at 10,000. Often, and it's the case here in Chicago, you'll usually have a string of houses, for example, all in the 6,000s on a given street, and that's because it's about 6 miles from the center of downtown. 1 mile in from that, they're all 5,000s, another mile they're all 4,000s, etc., etc. Now, not every...
I literally never knew that was the reason. I feel bad because I've lived here for 27 years. Never even thought about that. Never knew that was the reason why addresses are the way they are. That makes sense.
From that, they're all 5,000s. Another mile, they're all 4,000s, etc., etc. Now, not every city in the US does it from the center of the city. It could be from another part of the city or just some other central point. But that's sort of the general rule for how the numbering works on US houses. This one comes up again and again, that the United States is such a young country that it basically doesn't have a history. And I've always thought of this perception of America to be quite a lazy one. Because even if you go back to 1776 through to the present day, yes, it is a short amount of time in comparison to the history of Britain, but think about all of the insane things that happened in that period. And even if you ignore all that, there's one thing that we tend to forget because we don't get taught it very deeply in Britain, and that is the thousands of years of native history that happened before we even turned up. I was absolutely blown away.
We don't really get taught about that either. We don't get taught that. Not where I went to school. We didn't learn
of native history that happened before we even turned up. I was absolutely blown away. Not literally, that would be weird. When I went to Cahokia Mounds here in Illinois, many hundreds of years ago, Cahokia Mounds used to be a native city, and it had about 20,000 people, which might not sound like a lot by both American and British standards, but back in the day, that was more than London. And I once read about this volcano eruption that happened in present-day Oregon a few thousand years ago. And this eruption was witnessed and recorded by Native Americans who were in the area at the time. And long story short, they basically saw the origins of Crater Lake, which is absolutely huge. To be honest, both Brits and Americans love their myths. I mean, we've got the Loch Ness Monster, you've got a cryogenically frozen Walt Disney, and this new mystery on BritBox, Sherwood, has got...
modern-day Robin Hood.
Can we not do that?
Oh.
Start giving nicknames to wanted murderers and the press gets excited.
I'm gonna skip the sponsor, guys, if that's cool with y'all. All right, get back to it. The US and Canada are basically the same.
This one is embarrassing for me because years ago I believed that Canada and the United States were basically the same country. And the reason that I believe that is, number one, I was 12, so cut me some slack. And number two, my only sort of exposure to both countries was through the people, was through the way they spoke. And to my young ears, which couldn't yet differentiate these two accents, Macho Man Randy Savage and Bret Hart basically had the same accent, just with an entirely different timbre. And that's all I had to go on. And I think it's what a lot of British people have to go on, because I still occasionally see those comments. Oh, what is the difference between Canada and America? Or is it essentially that one has Mounties and the other doesn't? And it's only since I moved here that I've become super aware of the substantial difference between the two countries. Completely different healthcare systems, completely different food, completely different use of English. Right, in Britain, we call it the loo. In America, they call it a restroom. In Canada, they call it a washroom. And I've seen all manner of different examples of that kind of thing. In America, they don't celebrate Boxing Day. In Canada, they do. The Canadian dollar is different to the American dollar.
What is Boxing Day? I've never heard of that. What is that?
Don't celebrate Boxing Day. In Canada, they do. The Canadian dollar is different to the American dollar. In some ways, they go with British English in places that America doesn't. And now that I'm older and I've listened to some of the regionalisms throughout the United States, even the way Americans speak is different to how Canadians speak. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but these differences certainly go way beyond how the two countries pronounce the word about. I've touched on this before, but I couldn't really do a video without including it in this list. This perception that Americans are loud and boisterous. And I can understand on some level where that comes from, because I think the way Americans speak, it comes from a different part of the throat. So it's a bit more projected, right? Whereas us Brits, it's more sort of, I don't know, understated a lot of the time. I think another reason that we think Americans are loud is how they present themselves in films. There might even have been a time in my life where I thought all Americans were loud just because Jim Carrey was. He's Canadian, isn't he? He is Canadian.
I would say we're probably louder than, like, as a whole, we're louder than the British, but not all of us are loud. But I can take that myth and say there's a little bit of truth to it. Like you said, I didn't even think about that. We speak from a different part of the throat. That's very interesting. That's very interesting to hear. But yeah, we do. We're probably louder than the British, but not all of us are just like loud. And there's a lot of us that are shy and quiet.
Well, loud just because Jim Carrey was. He's Canadian, isn't he? He is Canadian. And culturally speaking, I definitely have found that Americans speak at a higher volume when they're in restaurants together. But there are so many other examples of the opposite being true. On match day, after we've had a pint or 6, you know, we're singing the songs of our team who we love because they happen to be situated in the town that we were born in. And it's just what we do when we leave a nightclub, which, you know, I haven't done in 20 years. But when we did, you know, I'd be on the street yelling at traffic cones because that might have just been me. But what I'm saying is, when we get drunk, we very much give Americans a run for their money. There's a loud person in all of us, right? And once we free ourselves of our inhibitions, we can let out all of the decibels we want. That's not a call to action. It's merely an observation.
Americans all walk around in fanny packs? No. That's a myth about Americans, that we all walk around with fanny packs? Really? Nobody I know walks around in a fanny pack. Nobody in my town. I don't know how it is. Like he said, America's very different and fluctuates with a lot of differences throughout the country. But nobody that I know walks around in fanny packs.
This is only funny, not because of the image of Americans walking around with bum bags on, but it's because we call them bum bags and you call them fanny packs, and it's bloody hilarious. It is also partly the visual, because bum bags have never been cool, but this notion, which I occasionally read, that Americans are just always walking around wearing one, is very laughable, especially as somebody who's lived here 14 years. So it's quite dumbfounding, this one. I'm not saying that all British people think this way, but the ones that do, I'd be very interested to hear, do they think that way because they met an American in 1994 and they've just held on to that belief? Or are American tourists still wearing bum bags? Do people carry cash? But I don't. I can tell you this, I don't have a bum bag / fanny pack radar, right? I am not constantly surveilling the populace to see whether they do or do not have a fanny pack. But my feeling is, I don't remember seeing one in a while. So I think this is one very time-specific stereotype that can now be laid to rest. All right?
Americans don't say autumn. Autumn? Is that autumn?
That can now be laid to rest. All right?
Autumn.
And yes, I thought I'd include one that was quite topical, not just because we are in the autumn, but also because I mentioned this fact on my YouTube short yesterday. Now, while for reasons that were laid out in that YouTube short, Americans prefer the term fall, I was surprised to find that the word autumn is pretty common among Americans. I don't know if this is a recent thing, like the whole country just woke up one morning and watched Lost in the Pond and thought to themselves, yes, we're changing things now. Or if it's just sort of always been here as an alternative to fall. And you might be thinking, ooh, Lawrence, aren't there many surprising word alternatives that Americans use that Brits don't know about? And the answer to that is yes. I merely brought this one up so I could make that very point. This is undoubtedly a pandemic era thing, but I've seen an increasing number of Americans using the word jab to mean shot. I once worked with an American colleague who liked to use the word bonkers. So in part because of the internet, just as Britain is taking on quite a few Americanisms, I think the same is true in reverse, and it will be very interesting to look further into those details. And those are just...
Yeah, I feel like autumn has always been a thing. Like autumn, when my growing up, I've always known like autumn. I usually do say fall. I will default. Fall is the default. I will say that. But I've said autumn
Same is
before.
true in reverse, and it will be very interesting to look further into those details. And those are just a handful of myths that some Brits believe about America and Americans. Let me know in the comments some of the myths that you've had to dispel about this country. I'm Lawrence Brown. You can follow me on Twitter at LostInThePondUS. And please subscribe to this channel and ensure to click my bell. And if you like what you see, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/LostInThePond. Until the next video, goodbye.
Shout out Lost in the Pond. That was definitely a good video. I definitely enjoyed that. Some of those myths I can't believe are believed about the U.S. Some of them I can understand why those are myths about the U.S. But that's all we got for this one. You guys got a favorite video suggestion? You can subscribe to Patreon or drop it in the comment section. Subscribe to the channel, ring notification bell, get a video a thumbs up so it gets suggested. Social media, Patreon, all up top. You can subscribe to any of it. Put all the links in the description. All you gotta do is hit the link. Follow me, talk to me. Love talking to you guys. You guys are the most incredible team on YouTube. It's your boy D Neal. Out.